Story 1. The Ghost of the Miller in Geethorn. It's in the picturesque village of Geethorn, known for its serene canals and charming bridges. There exists a legend that has haunted the locals for generations. The story tells of a miller who met his untimely demise under mysterious circumstances, and it is said that his restless spirit still lingers in the village, his presence marked by the eerie creaking of the old mill wheel. This tale, passed down through whispers and cautious glances, has become a part of the fabric of Geethorn, a place where beauty and mystery intertwine. The following account is one that I never imagined would be my own, an experience that has forever changed how I see this quiet village. It began on a warm summer evening when I decided to explore Geethorn, unaware that I was about to encounter something far more unsettling than the idyllic scenery the village is famous for. The evening sun bathed the village of Geethorn in a golden hue as I navigated my rented boat through the narrow canals. The stillness of the water, broken only by the occasional ripple, created a peaceful atmosphere that was both calming and, in a way, unnerving. It was hard to believe that such a tranquil place could be home to any sort of malevolence, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something lurking beneath the surface. Something the smiling faces of the villagers chose not to speak of. I had heard the stories, of course. Any visitor who spends more than a few hours in Geethorn will eventually catch wind of the legend of the old miller. It was a tale I initially dismissed as nothing more than local folklore, a story told to add a bit of intrigue to the otherwise sleepy village. But as the sun dipped lower in the sky and the shadows grew longer, the whispers of the past seemed to echo more loudly in my mind. I decided to stay in a small bed and breakfast owned by an elderly couple, both of whom seemed eager to share the history of their beloved village with me. Their home was situated at the edge of town, just beyond a particularly dense grove of trees that shielded the old mill from view. It was there, they told me, that the miller had met his end, though the exact circumstances of his death were shrouded in mystery. The mill hasn't been used in decades, the old woman explained as she handed me a cup of tea. They say the wheel stopped turning the night the miller died, and it hasn't moved since. Her husband, who had been listening quietly, nodded in agreement. People around here believe the mill is cursed. No one goes near it after dark. They say you can still hear the creaking of the wheel when the moon is full. I smiled politely, trying not to appear too skeptical. But the old man's eyes, dark and serious, seemed to bore into me as if searching for something. "Have you heard it?" I asked, more out of curiosity than belief. The old man hesitated, glancing at his wife before answering. "Once," he said quietly, "many years ago. It was a night much like this one. I was a young man then, foolish and curious. I thought the stories were just that. Stories. But when I heard the wheel, it was like nothing I've ever heard before. It was as if the mill was alive, groaning and creaking as if it was struggling to move after years of silence. I didn't dare go any closer. I ran home and never looked back." The room fell silent, the only sound the gentle ticking of an old clock on the wall. I sipped my tea, the warmth of the liquid doing little to ease the chill that had settled over me. "Would you like to see the mill?" the old woman asked suddenly, breaking the silence. "It's just a short walk from here. My husband can show you the way." I hesitated, unsure of how to respond. Part of me was intrigued, drawn to the mystery of the miller's ghost. But another part of me, the part that had always prided itself on being rational and logical, was reluctant to entertain the idea of chasing after old ghost stories. But then again, wasn't that part of the reason I had come to Geethorn in the first place? To experience the village in all its quaint charm, to immerse myself in the local culture and history. And what better way to do that than by visiting one of its most infamous landmarks? "I'd like that," I finally said, setting my cup down. "I'd like to see the mill." The old man stood up, his expression unreadable, and motioned for me to follow him. We stepped outside into the cool evening air, the sky now tinged with the deep blues and purples of twilight. The village was quiet, the only sounds the distant chirping of crickets and the occasional splash of water as a fish broke the surface of the canal. We walked in silence, the old man leading the way with sure, steady steps. The path we took was narrow and winding, lined with tall grass and wildflowers that brushed against my legs as we passed. The trees grew thicker as we approached the edge of the village, their branches intertwining overhead to form a canopy that blocked out what little light remained. And then as we rounded a bend in the path, I saw it, the old mill. It stood at the edge of a small clearing, its weathered wooden frame silhouetted against the darkening sky. The mill was larger than I had expected, its once proud structure now leaning slightly to one side as if bowed by the weight of time. The wheel, which had once been the heart of the mill, was still attached to the side of the building, though it looked as if it hadn't turned in years. The old man stopped a few paces away from the mill, his eyes fixed on the wheel. "This is as far as I go," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The miller, he was a good man, but something changed in him before he died. No one knows what happened, but it's said that his spirit can't find peace. Some nights, when the wind is just right, you can hear him trying to get the wheel to turn again. I nodded, though I wasn't sure what to say. The mill, though aged and dilapidated, didn't seem particularly frightening. If anything, it was a sad reminder of a time long past, a relic of a bygone era that had been left to decay. But as I stood there, staring at the mill, I felt a strange unease settle over me. It was as if the air around us had grown heavier, the light dimmer, the sounds of the village more distant. I shivered, pulling my jacket tighter around me. "Do you want to go closer?" the old man asked, his voice cutting through the stillness. I hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Yes, I think I do." He didn't follow me as I took a few tentative steps forward, the grass crunching softly underfoot. The closer I got to the mill, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. It was as if the very air was charged with something old and powerful that had been lying dormant for years. When I reached the base of the mill, I paused, unsure of what I was expecting to find. The wooden boards were weathered and cracked, the windows dark and empty. The wheel, though large and imposing, was covered in a thick layer of moss, its spokes splintered and worn. I reached out a hand to touch the wood, curious to feel the texture of the ancient structure. But as my fingers brushed against the rough surface, I felt a sudden, sharp jolt of cold that shot through my hand and up my arm, as if I had touched something electrified. I yanked my hand back, my heart racing. The cold lingered, an icy numbness that seemed to seep into my bones. I rubbed my hand, trying to restore some warmth, but the feeling persisted, and then I heard it. It was faint at first, barely more than a whisper carried on the wind. But as I stood there, frozen in place, the sound grew louder, more distinct. It was the creaking of the mill wheel. The noise was unmistakable, a low, groaning sound that seemed to echo in the stillness of the night. It was as if the wheel, long dormant and forgotten, was trying to turn once more, straining against the years of disuse. My breath caught in my throat as I listened, my eyes locked on the wheel. But it didn't move. The sound continued, a rhythmic creaking that sent chills down my spine, but the wheel itself remained still. I took a step back, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound grew louder, more insistent, as if urging me to come closer to touch the wheel again. But the cold that had seeped into my hand had spread, numbing my fingers and making it difficult to move. The old man's voice rang out, sharp and commanding. "We must leave now." I turned to see him standing a few paces away, his face pale and drawn. He was staring at the mill, his eyes wide with fear. "We need to go," he repeated, his voice trembling. I didn't argue. I backed away from the mill, the sound of the creaking wheel following me as I retreated. The further I got from the mill, the more the cold began to dissipate, though the memory of that icy touch lingered in my mind. By the time we reached the edge of the clearing, the sound had faded, replaced once more by the quiet of the village night. I glanced back at the mill, half expecting to see the wheel turning, but it remained still, shrouded in darkness. The old man led me back to the bed and breakfast without another word. The walk back felt longer, the night darker, and by the time we reached the house, I was exhausted both physically and mentally. Inside, the warmth of the fire was a welcome relief, but it did little to ease the tension that had settled over me. The old man and his wife exchanged a few quiet words, their expressions grave, before they left me alone in my room. I tried to sleep, but the events of the evening played over and over in my mind. The creaking of the wheel, the cold that had seeped into my bones, the feeling that something unseen had been watching me. It all felt too real, too vivid to dismiss as mere imagination. And then there was the old man's reaction. He had seemed genuinely frightened, his fear palpable in the way he had urged me to leave. Was it possible that there was some truth to the legend? Could the miller's spirit really be trapped in that old mill, doomed to relive his final moments over and over again? I didn't have any answers, but as I lay there in the darkness, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me back from the mill. Something cold and unseen, lurking just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to make itself known. The night passed slowly, the hours dragging by as I lay awake, listening to the sounds of the house. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind outside made me jump, my nerves on edge. It wasn't until the early hours of the morning that I finally drifted off to sleep, my mind still haunted by the events of the night. The next day I woke to the sound of birds chirping outside my window. The sunlight streamed in, casting a warm glow over the room, and for a moment I almost believed that the previous night had been nothing more than a bad dream. But the lingering chill in my bones told me otherwise. I dressed quickly and made my way downstairs, hoping to find some answers. The old couple was already up, preparing breakfast in the small kitchen. They greeted me warmly, but I could see the concern in their eyes. "Did you sleep well?" the old woman asked as she placed a plate of pancakes in front of me. I hesitated, unsure of how to respond. "Not really," I admitted. The old man glanced at his wife, then back at me. "You're not the first," he said quietly. "Many who visit the mill have trouble sleeping afterward. It's as if the place leaves a mark on you, something that lingers long after you've left." I nodded, my appetite fading as I thought about the previous night. "Do you think the miller's ghost is real?" I asked, the question slipping out before I could stop myself. The old couple exchanged a look, one that spoke of shared secrets and unspoken fears. Finally, the old man sighed and sat down across from me. "I don't know," he said honestly, "but I do know that there are things in this world that can't be easily explained. The mill, it's one of those places. Something happened there, something that left a scar on the village, and it's been festering ever since." He paused, as if weighing his next words carefully. "The villagers don't like to talk about it, but the miller's death was strange. He was a good man, well liked by everyone, but in the weeks leading up to his death, something changed. He became withdrawn, paranoid. He started seeing things that weren't there. People thought he was losing his mind, but then he died, and the mill stopped turning." The old woman placed a hand on her husband's shoulder, offering silent support. "No one knows how he died," she added softly. "His body was found in the mill, but there were no signs of a struggle, no obvious cause of death. It was as if he just stopped living." The room fell silent, the weight of their words hanging in the air. I didn't know what to say, my mind racing with questions. "Do you think it's connected?" I asked finally. "The voices he heard, the things he saw, do you think they were real?" The old man shrugged, his expression weary. "I don't know. But I do know that something changed in him, something that drove him to madness. Whether it was something real or just a product of his mind, I can't say, but whatever it was, it's still there in that mill, waiting." A shiver ran down my spine at his words, the memory of the cold, creeping sensation from the previous night resurfacing. "I don't think I want to go back there," I admitted, my voice trembling slightly. The old man nodded in understanding. "I don't blame you. But if you do go back, be careful. The mill, it's a dangerous place, and the miller, well, some say he's still trying to finish whatever he started before he died." I swallowed hard, the reality of the situation sinking in. This wasn't just a ghost story told to scare tourists. There was something more to it, something dark and unsettling that had left its mark on this village and its people. And now, it had left its mark on me. For the rest of the day, I tried to distract myself by exploring the village. Geathorn was as charming as ever, its canals lined with quaint cottages and flower-filled gardens. The locals went about their business, their smiles warm and inviting. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, something unseen and malevolent. I avoided the path that led to the mill, instead choosing to stay within the more populated areas of the village. But even among the crowds of tourists and the cheerful chatter of the locals, I couldn't escape the lingering unease that had settled over me. As the day wore on, the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the village. The air grew cooler, and the once cheerful atmosphere took on a more somber tone. The tourists began to disperse, and the locals retreated to their homes, leaving the village eerily quiet. I found myself standing at the edge of the canal, staring out at the darkening water. The events of the previous night played over and over in my mind, each detail more vivid and unsettling than the last. The creaking of the mill wheel, the icy cold that had seeped into my bones, the feeling that something was watching me. All of it felt too real, too intense to be dismissed as mere imagination. And then there was the old man's warning. His words had echoed in my mind all day, a constant reminder of the danger that lurked in the shadows of this seemingly peaceful village. But despite my fear, a part of me was still drawn to the mill. There was something there, something that needed to be uncovered, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was somehow connected to it. As the last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the horizon, I made my decision. I would return to the mill, if only to confront whatever it was that had left such a deep impression on me. I waited until the village was completely silent, the only sounds the distant rustling of leaves and the occasional splash of water. The night was darker than I had expected, the moon hidden behind a thick layer of clouds. I made my way back to the path that led to the mill, my footsteps soft and deliberate on the narrow, winding trail. The trees loomed overhead, their branches swaying gently in the breeze, casting eerie shadows on the ground. As I approached the clearing, the air grew colder, the same oppressive atmosphere from the previous night, settling over me like a heavy blanket. The mill stood in the distance, its dark silhouette barely visible against the night sky. I hesitated at the edge of the clearing, my heart pounding in my chest. The memory of the cold, numbing sensation from the previous night resurfaced, making me question my decision to return. But I had come this far, and turning back now would only leave me with more questions than answers. Taking a deep breath, I stepped into the clearing, the grass crunching softly underfoot. The air was thick with tension, each step forward feeling like a challenge to whatever force lingered in the shadows. When I reached the base of the mill, I paused, my eyes fixed on the old, weathered structure. The wheel, though still covered in moss and splintered from years of disuse, seemed to loom larger than before, its presence almost palpable. I reached out a hand, my fingers trembling as they brushed against the rough wooden boards. The cold hit me instantly, sharper and more intense than before, sending a jolt of icy pain through my hand and up my arm. But this time, I didn't pull away. I forced myself to hold on, to push past the numbing cold and focus on the mill. The creaking started again, the same low, groaning sound that had haunted me the night before. It was louder now, more insistent, as if the wheel was straining against some unseen force, trying to turn after years of silence. And then I heard something else. A voice. It was faint at first, barely more than a whisper carried on the wind. But as I stood there, my hand pressed against the cold wood, the voice grew louder, more distinct. It was the voice of a man, deep and raspy, filled with a desperation that sent chills down my spine. "Help me," it whispered, the words drawn out and strained. "Help me turn the wheel." I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The voice was coming from inside the mill, its tone urgent and pleading. But as much as I wanted to help, I couldn't move. The cold had spread through my entire body, paralyzing me with fear and leaving me rooted to the spot. The voice grew more frantic, the desperation in its tone palpable. "Please," it begged, "help me turn the wheel." I don't know how long I stood there, my hand pressed against the mill, the voice echoing in my ears. Time seemed to stretch on, each second dragging out into an eternity. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the voice stopped. The creaking of the wheel faded into silence, and the oppressive cold that had surrounded me began to lift. I gasped, pulling my hand away from the mill and stumbling back. The night was still and quiet, the only sound the rustling of leaves in the breeze. But the voice, the cold, the mill, it had all felt so real, so vivid. There was no denying that something had happened, something that went beyond the realm of the natural. I turned and ran, my footsteps pounding against the ground as I fled the clearing. The trees closed in around me, their branches clawing at my skin as I raced down the narrow path. By the time I reached the village, I was out of breath, my body trembling with fear and exhaustion. I didn't stop until I reached the safety of the bed and breakfast, slamming the door behind me and collapsing onto the floor. The old couple rushed to my side, their faces filled with concern as they helped me to my feet. "What's happened?" the old man asked, his voice laced with worry. I shook my head, unable to find the words to describe what I had experienced. All I could do was point in the direction of the mill, my hand still trembling from the cold. The old man exchanged a look with his wife, then turned back to me. "You need to rest," he said gently, guiding me to the nearest chair. "Whatever you saw out there, it's over now. You're safe here." But even as he spoke, I knew that it wasn't over. The mill, the voice, the cold, they were still out there waiting in the darkness, and I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever it was that haunted that mill, it wasn't done with me yet. As I sat there, the warmth of the fire slowly easing the chill from my bones, I realized that this village, with its charming canals and picturesque cottages, was hiding something far more sinister than I had ever imagined, and I was caught in the middle of it, a stranger in a place where the past refused to stay buried. After the night's ordeal, I tried to calm myself, convincing myself that it was merely a figment of my imagination. Yet, thoughts of the mill refused to leave my mind. It felt as though the mill was haunting me even in the waking world, casting its shadow over every moment. The old couple at the bed and breakfast were kind enough to let me rest through the morning. Their concern was evident, but they didn't press for details. I took their silence as a kindness, not wanting to revisit the terror of the previous night. By afternoon, I found myself drawn to the village once more. Despite my fear, I was determined to learn more about the miller's death and the mill's dark history. There had to be something more to the legend, something that could explain the eerie events of the night before. I started my search by visiting the local library, a modest building nestled at the edge of the village square. Inside, I found an elderly librarian who greeted me with a warm but wary smile. Her name was Mrs. Van Dorn, and she seemed to be familiar with the villagers' stories and secrets. "I'm looking for information about the old mill," I began. "Specifically, about the miller who died there." Mrs. Van Dorn's expression shifted, her eyes narrowing with a mix of curiosity and caution. "The miller, you say? That's quite a subject." I nodded, trying to hide my anxiety. "Yes, I've heard various stories about his death and the mill's history. I'd like to know more," she sighed, shuffling through the old newspapers and dusty archives. "Most of what we know is a mix of fact and folklore." The miller's name was Peter Van Galen. He was a well-liked man, but his final days were marked by increasing isolation and strange behavior. As she spoke, she handed me a yellowed newspaper article detailing Van Galen's death. The article was brief, mentioning that he had been found dead in the mill under mysterious circumstances. There were no signs of violence or foul play, just an unexplained stillness. "What do you know about the strange behavior?" I asked, scanning the text for more clues. Mrs. Van Dorn hesitated before continuing. "He started speaking of voices and shadows. Some said he was mad, but others believed he was onto something dark and hidden within the mill. His behavior became erratic, and he spoke of unfinished business." I took the article and thanked Mrs. Van Dorn, feeling a sense of unease settle over me. The pieces were starting to fit together, but the picture they formed was far from clear. I needed to know more about what might have driven Van Galen to madness with this new information. I visited the village archives, a small building filled with records and personal accounts from the villagers. Here, I found detailed diaries and letters that offered more insight into Van Galen's life and death. They spoke of a man who had become increasingly withdrawn and haunted by something he refused to discuss. The turning point came when I found a diary entry from a local woman named Anna Jansine. Her entry described a visit she had made to the mill shortly before Van Gielen's death. She wrote about feeling an overwhelming sense of dread and seeing strange symbols etched into the walls of the mill. Symbols were unfamiliar to her, but she noted their eerie and unsettling nature. Reading her account, a shiver ran down my spine. The symbols she described matched those I had seen in my brief glimpse inside the mill. There was something sinister about them, something that transcended mere superstition. As evening fell, I made my way back to the bed and breakfast, my mind racing with the day's discoveries. The miller's death, his strange behavior, the symbols, all of it painted a disturbing picture. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to uncover, something hidden deep within the mill. At night, despite my exhaustion, I decided to return to the mill. My resolve was stronger now, fueled by a need to confront the truth behind the miller's death and the malevolent presence that seemed to lurk there. The village was quiet as I left. The only sounds the distant calls of night birds and the rustling of leaves. The path to the mill was dark and foreboding, but I pressed on, determined to face whatever awaited me. When I reached the clearing, the mill stood silent and imposing. The air was thick with the same oppressive atmosphere I had felt the previous night. The moon was hidden behind clouds, leaving the mill in near-total darkness. I approached the mill with caution, my flashlight cutting a narrow beam through the darkness. As I neared the entrance, I noticed that the door, which had been ajar before, was now firmly shut. I hesitated for a moment before forcing it open. Pulled inside, the mill was just as I remember. Cold, dark, and filled with the scent of mildew and decay. I moved carefully, my flashlight revealing the same worn machinery and the mysterious symbols etched into the walls. With each step, the sense of dread grew stronger. The creaking of the old floorboards echoed in the silence, and the shadows seemed to shift and move in the dim light. I made my way to the central area of the mill, where the wheel had once been. It was now still, its surface covered in a thick layer of dust. I took out the diary entry from Anna Jansen and began examining the symbols more closely. They were intricate, with twisting patterns and shapes that seemed almost alive in the flickering light. There was a sense of malevolence about them, as if they were imbued with a dark energy. Suddenly I heard a noise. It was faint at first, barely more than a whisper carried on the wind, but as I listened it grew louder, more insistent. It was the same voice I had heard before, now pleading and desperate. "Help me," the voice whispered. "Complete the circle." The words were barely audible, but they sent a shiver through me. I turned, searching for the source of the voice, but there was no one there. The cold seemed to intensify, wrapping around me like a suffocating shroud. I moved toward the wheel, my flashlight revealing an old ledger lying on the ground. I picked it up, flipping through the pages to find detailed records of the mill's operations and maintenance. At the back of the ledger, there was a strange drawing, a diagram of the mill's inner workings with a circle and various symbols around it. The realization hit me like a bolt of lightning. The symbols on the walls, the strange behavior of Van Galen, they were all connected to some sort of ritual or occult practice. The miller had been involved in something dark and dangerous, and it had ultimately led to his death. The voice grew louder, the desperation in its tone palpable. "Help me complete the circle," it repeated, the words echoing through the mill. I felt a sudden urge to act. I knew that whatever was trapped in the mill needed something to be finished, something left undone. The symbols in the drawing seemed to be a key to unlocking whatever had been set in motion. With trembling hands, I began to trace the symbols on the walls, trying to replicate the diagram from the ledger. As I worked, the cold around me grew more intense, and the shadows seemed to close in. The voice continued to plead, its urgency mounting. Finally, I completed the circle. The moment I finished, the temperature in the mill dropped sharply. The air grew heavier, and the voice ceased, abruptly replaced by an eerie silence. I stepped back, my heart racing as I looked around the mill. The oppressive atmosphere had lifted, but the sense of unease remained. It was as if something had been released, but I couldn't tell if it was a release of good or ill. With a final glance at the mill, I turned and left, my footsteps echoing in the still night. I made my way back to the bed and breakfast, my mind reeling from the events of the night. The next morning, I packed my things and prepared to leave the village. The old couple wished me well, their expressions filled with a mixture of relief and concern. "Be careful out there," the old man said as I was about to depart. "Sometimes, the things we encounter leave marks on us, even if we can't see them." I nodded, understanding his words more than ever. The village of Geethorn had been a place of beauty and mystery, but it had also revealed a darker side that I would never forget. As I drove away, I looked back at the village, the quaint canals and charming cottages now tinged with a new sense of foreboding. The mill, standing silent and still, seemed to watch me as I left, its secrets once again shrouded in darkness. And though I had faced the miller's ghost and uncovered some of the mill's mysteries, I knew that some questions would remain unanswered. The mill's shadow would forever linger in my mind, a reminder of the dark forces that can lie hidden even in the most picturesque place. Story 2. The disappearance in St. Lawrence. In the cold, shadowy waters of the St. Lawrence River, a mysterious disappearance in 2010 shook the small fishing community of Quebec. This story unravels the events leading to the vanishing of a local fisherman, Jacques Morin, and the subsequent investigation that exposed alarming safety and working conditions within the fishing industry. As we delve into this unsettling tale, you'll discover how a routine fishing trip transformed into a haunting mystery, leaving the entire community questioning the very safety of their livelihoods. The river's surface was eerily calm that day in late October, an unseasonal stillness hanging in the air as if nature itself was holding its breath. The cold mist clung to the water, obscuring the horizon where the sky and river seemed to merge into a hazy, indistinguishable line. Jacques Morin had been out on his boat, the Ellispoir, since before dawn, as he did every day. The boat, a sturdy vessel with its dark blue hull and peeling paint, bobbed gently on the water, its nets already spread in anticipation of a bountiful catch. Jacques was a seasoned fisherman, known for his quiet demeanor and his uncanny ability to predict where the best catch could be found. He had a reputation in the small village of Bay St. Paul, where a tight-knit community had come to rely on his expertise and consistency. That morning, as Jacques set out, everything seemed normal, save for a subtle chill in the air that hinted at the approaching winter. The sky was a slate gray, and the occasional gust of wind sent ripples across the river's surface, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary. By noon, when Jacques had not yet returned, a ripple of concern began to spread through the village. His wife, Marie, noticed that Jacques' usual routine had been disrupted. They had planned to meet for lunch as they often did, and his absence was a cause for worry. The first few hours of his delay were dismissed as an extended fishing trip. After all, Jacques had faced rough weather before and always returned. But as the day wore on and Jacques remained missing, the concern grew palpable. Marie tried calling his cell phone, but it went straight to voicemail. She contacted other local fishermen, but none had seen Jacques or his boat. As nightfall approached, a search party was organized. The community, though small, was tightly knit, and word spread quickly. Fishermen and villagers alike gathered at the docks, their faces etched with worry and their voices tinged with anxiety. The search began in earnest, with boats casting wide nets across the river and a helicopter flying overhead, its searchlights cutting through the encroaching darkness. The sound of the chopper's rotor blades created a haunting backdrop to the growing tension on the dock. The night wore on with no sign of Jacques or the Ellispoir. It wasn't until the following morning that the first clue emerged. The Ellispoir was found adrift in the river, its nets tangled and its motor idling. The boat showed no signs of damage or struggle, and there was no indication of what might have caused Jacques to abandon it. The equipment and supplies on board were intact, but Jacques was nowhere to be found. The discovery was both perplexing and deeply unsettling. It was as if Jacques had simply vanished into thin air. An initial investigation by local authorities failed to yield any concrete answers. There were no signs of foul play or an accident. The boat had been in good working condition, and the river had not experienced any unusual conditions that might explain the disappearance. The authorities were baffled, and the case began to attract attention from outside agencies. The investigation was taken over by the provincial police, and a more thorough examination of Jacques' disappearance commenced. The search area was expanded, and divers were deployed to explore the river. Despite their efforts, no trace of Jax was found. As days turned into weeks, the case grew colder, and the community's anxiety turned into frustration. As the investigation continued, troubling details began to surface about the conditions under which local fishermen operated. It was revealed that the fishing industry in the area was fraught with safety issues. Boats like the LS Squire often operated with outdated equipment and inadequate safety measures. The fishermen's working conditions were harsh, with long hours and minimal support in case of emergencies. Jacques' disappearance became a focal point in a larger discussion about the industry's negligence. Rumors began to circulate that Jacques had been involved in a dispute with his employer regarding safety concerns. It was said that he had been vocal about the need for better equipment and practices, which had reportedly caused tension between him and the fishing company. Some speculated that his disappearance was somehow connected to these disputes, but there was no solid evidence to support these claims. The situation took a darker turn when a former colleague of Jacques came forward with unsettling information. This individual revealed that Jacques had confided in him about strange occurrences in the river, unexplained disturbances, and odd sensations that he had experienced while fishing. According to the colleague, Jacques had felt uneasy about these experiences and had even mentioned a growing fear that something was terribly wrong with the river. This revelation added an eerie layer to the mystery. The idea that Jacques had sensed something sinister in the river, combined with the poor safety conditions, created a chilling narrative that captured the public's imagination. The story of Jacques Morin's disappearance became a symbol of broader issues within the fishing industry, with people wondering if there was more to his vanishing than met the eye. An investigation dragged on, with no new leads. The river, once a source of livelihood and sustenance, had become a silent witness to a haunting mystery. Jacques Morin's disappearance remained unsolved, and the case grew colder with each passing day. In the quiet village of Bay St. Paul, the absence of Jacques was felt deeply. His empty chair at the local pub, his vacant spot at community events, and the silent acknowledgement of his missing presence were constant reminders of the mystery that had unfolded. The river, with its murky depths and hidden secrets, continued to flow, carrying with it the unanswered questions of Jacques' fate. As we move into the second part of this story, we will delve deeper into the investigation's revelations, the impact on the local community, and the unsettling truths that emerged about the fishing industry. The story of Jacques Morin is far from over, and the shadows of the St. Lawrence River hold more secrets waiting to be uncovered. In the wake of Jacques Morin's disappearance, the town of Bay St. Paul was gripped by an uneasy silence. The investigation had hit a standstill, and the local community was left to grapple with the unsettling void left by Jacques' sudden absence. The quiet, once a comforting blanket, now felt suffocating as the river continued to flow, indifferent to the turmoil it had caused. The provincial police, under increasing pressure from the public and local media, decided to expand their investigation. New forensic methods were employed, and the search was widened to include more remote areas of the St. Lawrence River. Despite these efforts, the river's secrets remained elusive, and the case grew colder with each passing week. The police began to suspect that Jacques' disappearance might be linked to something far more sinister than an accident or misfortune. As the investigation dragged on, more details about the local fishing industry came to light. The media, hungry for stories, uncovered a series of disturbing revelations about the conditions under which local fishermen worked. It was reported that many boats, including Jacques L'Espoir, were operating with outdated equipment and minimal safety measures. These revelations sparked outrage among the community and led to increased scrutiny of the fishing companies. Former employees of these companies began to speak out, sharing stories of hazardous working conditions and neglectful practices. It became clear that Jacques' concerns about safety were not isolated. They were part of a larger pattern of issues within the industry. Some former colleagues claimed that Jacques had been particularly vocal about the need for change, citing specific instances where safety protocols had been ignored or inadequately addressed. The tension surrounding these revelations grew, and whispers of corruption and cover-ups began to circulate. The fishing industry was a vital part of the local economy, and many feared that exposing its flaws could have devastating consequences for the community. Yet, the desire for justice for Jacques outweighed these concerns. The community rallied behind the call for a thorough investigation and demanded accountability for the industry's failures. Amidst this growing uproar, an independent investigative journalist named Claire Dubois took a keen interest in Jacques' case. Claire, known for her tenacity and dedication to uncovering the truth, began her own investigation. She interviewed Jacques' friends, family, and former colleagues, piecing together a more comprehensive picture of the circumstances leading up to his disappearance. Claire discovered a particularly troubling detail during her interviews. Jacques had been involved in a clandestine investigation of his own. He had been gathering evidence of safety violations and had been planning to expose these issues to the public. According to his notes, Jacques had documented several instances where fishing companies had failed to comply with safety regulations, endangering the lives of their workers. The notes also included references to strange occurrences and unexplained phenomena that Jacques had encountered while fishing. One entry described an incident where Jacques had seen a mysterious figure moving along the riverbank, a shadowy figure that seemed to vanish when approached. Jacques had written about his growing unease and fear, expressing concerns that someone or something was trying to prevent him from uncovering the truth. As Claire delved deeper, she uncovered more unsettling evidence. Jacques had recently discovered a series of hidden compartments within the L'Espoir. These compartments, which had been meticulously concealed, contained documents and photographs related to safety violations and irregularities within the fishing industry. Claire surmised that Jacques had been on the brink of exposing a major scandal, and his disappearance might have been a direct result of his investigations. The more Claire uncovered, the clearer it became that Jacques' disappearance was not an isolated incident, but part of a broader conspiracy. The safety issues within the fishing industry were not just about poor equipment and hazardous working conditions. They were symptoms of a deeper problem involving corruption and cover-ups. The industry's failures were being concealed by those in power, and Jacques had become a threat to their secret. The breakthrough came when Claire managed to secure an interview with a former high-ranking employee of one of the fishing companies. This whistleblower revealed that Jacques had indeed been targeted by the company's security team, which had been tasked with silencing any dissenting voices. According to the whistleblower, Jacques had been followed, and his movements monitored in the days leading up to his disappearance. With this new information, Claire and the provincial police revisited the case with renewed vigor. They focused their investigation on the possibility of foul play, examining records and interviewing key figures within the fishing industry. The pressure from the public and the media continued to build, and the authorities were forced to take a closer look at the industry's practices. Despite the mounting evidence, Jacques Morin's fate remained a mystery. The investigation revealed numerous problems within the fishing industry, but it did not provide concrete answers about what had happened to Jacques. His case became a symbol of the dangers faced by those who dared to challenge powerful interests and exposed the harsh realities of an industry that prioritized profit over safety. In the years following Jacques' disappearance, the fishing industry underwent significant changes. New regulations were introduced and safety standards were improved in response to the public outcry. However, the memory of Jacques Morin and the unanswered questions about his disappearance lingered in the community. The St. Lawrence River continued to flow, its depths holding the secrets of Jacques' fate. The story of his disappearance became a cautionary tale, a reminder of the dangers that lurk in the shadows of powerful industries and the cost of seeking the truth. For the people of Bay St. Paul, Jacques' absence remained a haunting presence, a testament to the risks faced by those who confront the darkness hidden beneath the surface. As the community continued to grapple with the legacy of Jacques Morin's disappearance, the river carried on its eternal course, indifferent to the human struggles that played out upon its waters. The mystery of Jacques Morin may never be fully resolved, but his story remains a poignant reminder of the quest for justice and the enduring power of uncovering the truth. Story 3. The Mystery of Engelberg's Disappearance. In the serene alpine village of Engelberg, where snow-covered peaks and pristine landscapes create a picturesque setting, a sinister mystery began to unfold. This is the story of Martin Fisher, a well-known local figure who vanished under enigmatic circumstances. The investigation into his disappearance would reveal unsettling secrets hidden within the shadows of the mountain, challenging the perceptions of those who thought they knew their town inside out. Engelberg, a small Swiss village nestled at the foot of majestic mountains, was the epitome of tranquility as winter approached. The landscape, draped in a thick layer of snow, shimmered under the pale light of the late autumn sun. Martin Fisher, a man in his early 40s with a reputation for kindness and an infectious smile, was a beloved member of the community. His sudden disappearance would send ripples of fear and uncertainty through the town, unraveling a tale more complex than anyone could have imagined. It was on a crisp November afternoon that Martin set out for his usual walk along the forest path. This path, winding through dense woods and leading up to a small clearing known only to the locals, was a favorite of his. Martin had often spoken about the peace he found in nature, away from the daily hustle of village life. He was seen leaving his cottage, a quaint home with ivy creeping up its stone walls, carrying only a light backpack and a walking stick. The day was clear, the air biting but invigorating, making it the perfect time for his solitary stroll. When Martin failed to return by evening, concern began to grow among his friends and family. Klaus, my close friend, was one of the last people to see Martin that day. They had shared a warm drink at the local tavern, discussing the upcoming winter festival and Martin's plans to help with the preparations. Klaus recalled Martin being in good spirits, animatedly talking about the changes he was planning for his garden next spring. Nothing in their conversation suggested that Martin had any reason to be distressed or worried. As darkness fell, the village erupted into a flurry of activity. A search party was quickly assembled, comprised of volunteers and local authorities. I joined the effort, driven by a growing sense of unease. The once familiar forest now seemed foreboding, its shadows lengthening as night enveloped the landscape. The search was conducted with a mixture of urgency and dread. Lanterns bobbed through the darkness, casting eerie glows on the snow-covered ground, while our voices echoed into the stillness, calling out for Martin. Despite the intensive search, the only trace of Martin was a set of faint footprints that led into the forest and abruptly ended. The snow had covered the tracks, making it impossible to determine which direction he had taken after that. The lack of any other evidence, no signs of a struggle, no indication that anyone else had been in the vicinity, only added to the confusion. The only anomaly was a small pendant lying in the snow near the last visible footprint. It was a delicate piece of jewelry, intricately designed with symbols unfamiliar to us. Inspector Muller, an experienced and diligent officer, arrived the following morning with a team of forensic experts. The pendant was collected and sent for analysis, but its origins remained unknown. The inspector conducted thorough interviews with everyone who had been in contact with Martin recently. Each account painted a picture of an ordinary day, with no hints of impending trouble. Martin was described as a content, well-liked individual with no apparent enemies. As the days passed, the sense of anxiety in the village grew palpable. Engelberg, usually a haven of peace, was now overshadowed by an unsettling silence. Rumors began to circulate. Some spoke of supernatural forces, while others suggested a more sinister explanation. Theories about ancient legends and forgotten rituals began to surface, fueled by the mysterious pendant and the absence of tangible evidence. During one of my own explorations of the search area, I stumbled upon something that sent chills down my spine. Hidden beneath a blanket of snow and partially obscured by underbrush, I discovered an old wooden box. Its surface was weathered and covered in strange symbols, worn down by time. The box was surprisingly heavy, and as I pried it open, I found a collection of artifacts and a journal. The artifacts included a mix of old coins, tarnished medallions, and faded photographs. The photographs depicted scenes from a bygone era, with people dressed in clothes from the early 20th century. The journal, however, was the most intriguing item. It was bound in cracked leather, and the pages were filled with handwritten notes and sketches. The writing was in a language I could not decipher, and the sketches depicted bizarre symbols and rituals. I took the box to Inspector Muller, who agreed that it was worth further investigation. The historical records of Engelberg revealed that the village had once been home to a secretive group whose activities were shrouded in mystery. This group, known as the Keepers of the Veil, was rumored to have practiced rituals connected to ancient folklore and the occult. The symbols on the box matched those found in an old manuscript that had been preserved in the local archive. The manuscript described a hidden place within the mountains, rumored to be a gateway to another realm. As we delved deeper into the town's history, we uncovered a series of unsettling coincidences. The manuscript's description of the hidden place bore a striking resemblance to the area where Martin had vanished. The further we investigated, the more the story seemed to intertwine with ancient legends and local superstitions. The pendant, the journal, and the wooden box seemed to be pieces of a puzzle that led back to the enigmatic group and their activities. Despite the mounting evidence suggesting a connection between Martin's disappearance and the town's dark past, the investigation continued to hit dead ends. The sense of dread grew stronger as winter tightened its grip on Engelberg. The once vibrant village now felt like a place frozen in time, haunted by the shadow of Martin's disappearance. The locals began to avoid the forest, and the paths where Martin had walked became shrouded in an eerie silence. The search efforts persisted, but the cold weather and deepening snow made the task increasingly difficult. As we pieced together the clues, the mystery of Martin's vanishing took on a more ominous tone. The investigation had uncovered more questions than answers, and the villagers were left with a growing sense of unease. The disappearance of Martin Fisher was no longer just a case of a missing person. It had become a window into a hidden and unsettling part of Engelberg's history. As the winter nights grew longer, the town was consumed by a chilling sense of anticipation. The secrets of the past were beginning to resurface, and the search for Martin was far from over. The truth behind his disappearance was waiting to be uncovered, and the darkness that had long been buried in the heart of Engelberg was about to be revealed. In the quiet moments of the night, as the snow continued to fall softly over Engelberg, the village remained in a state of anxious anticipation. The investigation into Martin Fisher's disappearance had only just begun, and the story was far from its conclusion. The chilling events were far from over. The mystery of Engelberg's shadowed past promised to unfold in ways that would test the limits of belief and uncover the true nature of the forces at work. As Engelberg's wintry silence deepened, the investigation into Martin Fisher's disappearance grew increasingly complex. With each passing day, the search for Martin became intertwined with an exploration of the town's shadowy past, revealing secrets long buried beneath the snow-covered surface. The second part of this chilling tale delves deeper into the mystery that had gripped the village, unearthing truths that would alter their perception of reality forever. The arrival of a particularly harsh winter only compounded the tension in Engelberg. The snow fell relentlessly, blanketing the village in a thick layer of white that muffled sounds and distorted familiar landscapes. The search for Martin Fisher was now conducted in increasingly adverse conditions, making the task seem almost insurmountable. Despite the relentless efforts of the villagers and authorities, the trail remained cold. The wooden box I discovered, along with its cryptic contents, continued to be a focal point of our investigation. The journal's language, though still indecipherable, was now being analyzed by experts brought in from Zurich. We hoped they could shed light on the symbols and writings, which seemed to hint at ancient practices and rituals. Just one evening, as I was going through the artifacts again, I noticed something new. Among the faded photographs in the box was a picture of a group of people standing in front of an old stone structure. The building, obscured by overgrown vegetation, seemed eerily familiar. The photograph was dated from the early 1900s, and one of the figures in the image bore a striking resemblance to Martin. The realization sent a shiver down my spine. Could Martin have stumbled upon something he wasn't meant to? Inspector Muller was intrigued by the photograph and agreed that it might provide a crucial lead. We decided to investigate the location shown in the picture, which appeared to be an abandoned stone structure deep within the forest. The structure was described in the manuscript as a place of significance, a site connected to the mysterious keepers of the veil. We ventured into the forest, the snow crunching beneath our boots as we navigated through the dense trees. The search party, now accustomed to the cold and fatigue, pressed on with a sense of determination. After several hours of trudging through the snow, we finally arrived at the site depicted in the photograph. The structure was indeed real, a crumbling ruin that seemed to have been untouched for decades. Its walls were adorned with symbols similar to those on the wooden box. The site had an unsettling atmosphere, and as we explored the interior, we discovered remnants of what appeared to be old rituals. There were faded markings on the walls, broken artifacts, and strange, half-buried objects that seemed out of place. One particular find stood out. A hidden compartment within the stone walls revealed a small, sealed container. Inside was a collection of old scrolls and a second journal. This new journal, unlike the previous one, was written in a language that our experts could decipher. It detailed the activities of the Keepers of the Veil, a group that was said to practice rites intended to commune with entities beyond the known world. The scrolls described ceremonies that involved summoning rituals, believed to open portals to other realms. The writings suggested that these practices were performed at specific sites that corresponded with locations in Engelberg's surrounding forests. The more we read, the clearer it became that the Keepers' activities were shrouded in both mystery and fear, their rituals believed to summon forces beyond human comprehension. With this newfound knowledge, the investigation took a dramatic turn. The connections between Martin's disappearance and the activities of the Keepers were becoming more evident. It seemed Martin had unwittingly crossed paths with something deeply connected to these ancient practices. The search now extended to uncovering any possible link between Martin's last known locations and the sites described in the text. Meanwhile, the village remained on edge. The winter's severity had not only made the search more difficult, but it also amplified the sense of unease among the residents. Many had begun to avoid the areas around the forest, fearful of the unknown. Whispers of curses and supernatural forces became more frequent, adding to the growing tension. As I reviewed the scrolls in the warmth of my home, I received a cryptic message. The letter, left anonymously on my doorstep, contained a single sentence written in an unfamiliar script. "The veil thins where shadows fall." It was signed with a symbol that matched those found in the journal and on the wooden box. The message seemed to suggest that the key to understanding Martin's fate lay in unraveling the mystery of the veil and its connection to the shadows. Determined to follow this lead, I reached out to an expert in local folklore and occult studies. Dr. Helen Adler, a historian with a focus on ancient rituals, agreed to assist. She examined the texts and provided insights into the significance of the veil. According to her research, the veil was believed to be a barrier between the known world and the supernatural realm. The rituals described in the scrolls were intended to thin this veil, allowing communication with entities from beyond. Dr. Adler suggested that the site of Martin's disappearance might be a place where the veil was particularly thin, making it easier for supernatural forces to influence or interact with the physical world. This theory added a new layer of urgency to our search, as it implied that Martin's disappearance might be connected to forces beyond our understanding. As the investigation progressed, we received a breakthrough. A local resident reported seeing strange lights in the forest on the night Martin disappeared. The lights, described as flickering orbs, were unlike anything seen before and were said to have hovered above the ground. This sighting matched descriptions of phenomena often associated with supernatural activity. For this information, we organized another search, focusing on the area where the lights were reported. The search was arduous, with the cold and darkness adding to the challenge. As we scoured the forest, we stumbled upon a series of markings on the trees, symbols similar to those found in the ancient texts. These markings led us to a hidden cave, partially concealed by the snow and rocks. Inside the cave, we found remnants of a recent ritual. The floor was littered with candles, broken ceremonial objects, and symbols etched into the walls. At the center of the cave was a small altar, covered in dust, but clearly used for some form of ceremony. The cave's atmosphere was heavy, and a sense of foreboding pervaded the air. Among the items on the altar was a piece of parchment with a detailed map. The map indicated several locations within the forest, each marked with symbols corresponding to those in the ancient texts. The final mark was at a location near the clearing where Martin was last seen. It was as if the map was leading us to the very spot where something significant had occurred. We followed the map to the clearing, where the snow was disturbed, and the ground appeared to have been recently disturbed. It was here that we found a buried cache. Inside, there were personal items belonging to Martin, including his watch and a small notebook. The notebook contained entries that hinted at Martin's growing unease about what he had discovered in the forest. His last entry was cryptic, mentioning a hidden truth and forces beyond. The discovery of these items added a new dimension to the investigation. It became clear that Martin had uncovered something he wasn't meant to find, something that had put him in grave danger. The clues suggested that his disappearance was not merely the result of a simple accident, but was connected to ancient practices and supernatural forces. As we pieced together the final elements of the investigation, the truth began to emerge. Martin Fisher had become entangled in a mystery that reached back to the very foundations of Engelberg's history. His disappearance was not just a case of a missing person, but a chilling reminder of the hidden forces that lurked beneath the surface of the village's idyllic exterior. The story of Martin's fate was far from a neat resolution. As we concluded our investigation, the mystery of Engelberg remained unresolved, a haunting reminder of the darkness that can dwell even in the most serene places. The village, once a symbol of peace, was now forever changed by the shadows that had been revealed. The winter continued to hold Engelberg in its icy grip, and the tale of Martin Fisher became a legend whispered among the residents. The search for answers had led to a deeper understanding of the town's hidden past, but the true nature of the forces at work remained an enigma. As the snow fell softly over the village, the mystery lingered, a chilling reminder that some secrets are best left buried in the darkness.